Hello, everyone. This is Gene Geog History, and today I'm going to break down most likely the final racial category or the major category in Jamaica that I'm going to cover. I covered Black Jamaicans, I've covered White Jamaicans, I've covered Inno Jamaicans, as well as Liquor Jamaicans, I've covered the Browning class Jamaicans, and I might have missed one more. And today I'm going to cover the Chinese Jamaicans. And obviously, to do that, I need to first discuss what that is and then go through their history. So, when it comes to the official definition, Chinese Jamaicans are Jamaican people of Chinese ancestry, whether they themselves or their parents migrated from China and moved to Jamaica, or they have ancestors who came from China and they've been in Jamaica for some generations. This can include people of mixed Chinese ancestry, though that would make them mixed race and not monoracial. But for this video, I'm mainly focusing on people who are monoracially Chinese, but their nationality is Jamaican. So essentially, Chinese people who moved to Jamaica and then they procreated with other Chinese people, where they became their own ethnogenesis to be Chinese Jamaicans. So, an interesting point to mention is that on average, the Chinese Jamaicans, they came from the Hakka region in China, which is in southern China. So I'm assuming that's where the British essentially set up their boats and their travel to China to pick them up from Hakka and brought them to Jamaica. So the start of the Chinese presence in Jamaica started the same way and the same time that the Indian presence in Jamaica started becoming a thing. Within the 19th century, where slavery ended in Jamaica, and the British wanted a function that was a replacement of some sorts. So there's lots of Jamaican migration to the West Indies going all the way back to 1811, but the first time was really done in 1843 with bringing Chinese workers to Jamaica, British Guyana, which is now known as Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago, but nothing really came out of it like that. So the real migration to Jamaica and the two earlier ships that came to Jamaica arrived in 1854 with the first directly from China, mainly Hakka and what's now known as modern day Hong Kong, and the second coming from Panama, where there were contracted plantation workers who came from China to Panama and they then sent them to Jamaica. Further 200 arrived in 1870, so that was the second wave, though they mainly came from other Caribbean islands. And then 14 years later, in 1884, there was a third group of Chinese migrants, around 680 came, and most of those workers came from the Hakka people from Dungan, Huyang, and Bayang. And don't mind me if I mispronounce things, and I apologize. And with this third wave, a lot of them brought their relatives over, so there's a more foundation for Chinese families to build their presence in Jamaica. So, I briefly mentioned that the Chinese indentured immigrants was aimed to replace the outlawed system of black slavery. So, it essentially entailed a 5-year contract that bounded the laborers physically to specific planters and their estates and subjugated them to physical and financial penalties whenever any contractual obligation conditions were broken. And this was essentially them working on the sugar plantations. The contracts on average consisted of a $4 wage for a 12-hour workday, which also included food, clothing, medical care, and housing. Although these contracts were regularly violated, as the European plantation owners pretty much gave them poor food, poor housing, poor clothes, and they pretty much didn't follow the contract heavily. So, in addition to this, Chinese immigrants could also arrive independent of the indentured system. So, though I think that was probably later on. And these independent immigrants could come by paying their own way as an individual free migrant, or they could come sponsored and have their passage paid for reimbursement. And in 1917, the entire indentured immigration system was outlawed, largely due to pressure from Gandhi, who was then leading the nationalist movement in India. So yet again, those two were kind of just tied together. The indentured servitude contract were limited with no repatriation to China, and they received fixed wages, basic free housing, and limited medical care while providing labor for years. Some re-indentured after their contracts expired, while others drifted away from the plantation system to engage in retail business, form distinct communities in Jamaica, or integrate into the host society. And like the Indians, some of the Chinese Jamaicans also had issues going back to China because there's a lack of both, and some of the Chinese people in China didn't really want to claim them again, in addition to a bunch of other issues. Okay, so I'm going to go over a very brief timeline of Chinese Jamaicans in Jamaica. So, when it comes to the early arrival, so this is through the mid to late 1800s. So, like I mentioned earlier, in 1854, the first small group of Chinese migrants, workers from Hong Kong, brought to Jamaica as indentured laborers, intended for a plantation after emancipation, reduced the labor force, and most did not stay during this initial migration. Through the 1860s and 1870s, additional small groups of Chinese migrants, mainly Hakka and Cantonese men, arrived, many through indentured contracts. There was a very high mortality rate, and the return migration at this point also kept the numbers very low. Though there were some that, of course, got with the black women, since at this time they were bringing over Chinese women. So there were some census reports of the Chinese Jamaicans by the time of the late 19th century, as in the 1884 census, there were 481 Chinese Jamaicans recorded in that census. In the 1891 census, which was only 7 years later, it increased to 693 Chinese people, so over 200 more, and this made up 0.1% of the total population. And then through the 1890s and even some of the 1900s, the immigration restrictions were placed at this point, slowing the direct arrival of Chinese Jamaicans at this point. Still, Chinese Jamaicans began to establish small shops, groceries, and restaurants across rural towns. So we have some more census reports throughout the early 20th century, as in the 1911 census, there are reported to be 2,111 Chinese people. So as you see, within the last 20 years, it increased a lot. 10 years later, in the 1921 census, there are 3,369 Chinese people, so it increased by over 1,000 here. And then in the 1931 census, 10 years after the 1921 census, there are 6,276 Chinese people. So just within that 20-year time gap, there is an increase of Chinese people by 4,000. So the community and ethnogenesis grew steadily as migration continued from the Guangdong province, and the Hakka Chinese were the vast majority at this point. So by this time, the Chinese Jamaicans were widely associated with retail trade, especially small groceries and dry goods stores, i.e., Chinese shops, and that's still a thing today. So in the mid 20th century, on the 1943 census, there were 12,394 Chinese people, making up 0.6% of the population now. And just from the last census, or at least from 1931 to 1943, so that's 12 years, it essentially increased by double. So as you will see here, things would start to dip after this, where in the 1960 census, there were 11,710 Chinese people, so it decreased by like 600, 700, as the numbers started to dip out around this point in the 1960s as out-migration increased, whether to Canada, to US, and to the UK. And I know my fair share of Chinese Jamaican people, or people of Chinese Jamaican descent, who obviously left Jamaica. And the Chinese Benevolent Association, which was founded in 1891, became an anchor institution at around this period. So, within the late 20th century, in the 1970 census, there were 500, 320 Chinese people, so it decreased by more than half just within the last 10 years, and now they made up 0.3% of the population. So there was a sharp decline due to political instability in the 1970s under Manley's government, which accelerated migration of middle class Jamaicans, including many Chinese families. So this was around the time where my family started leaving Jamaica. So obviously it would make sense that non-black Jamaicans would also leave at around this time. Many Chinese Jamaicans moved to Toronto, New York, Miami, and London, and under other diaspora hubs. And within the 21st century, going by the 2001 census, there are about 3,000 Chinese Jamaicans, so 0.1%. And then in the 2011 census, Chinese were not listed separately in published reports, but secondary sources suggest that the numbers remained low throughout. So, currently, the Chinese Jamaican community is small but historically significant. Most Chinese Jamaicans are descendants of the Hakka settlers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They contributed strongly to Jamaica's commerce, music, example being Byron Lee, and politics, even though their share of the population has shrunk to a tiny fraction. So it seemed like the population of Chinese Jamaicans peaked within the mid 20th century, then it decreased again to the numbers where it was earlier. Okay, so I kind of want to talk about the trials and tribulations when it comes to the cultural integration and historical challenges of the Chinese Jamaicans, especially since they are a minority population. So, when it comes to the cultural integration, Chinese Jamaicans have maintained their cultural identity, preserving traditions and language while also blending in with Jamaican customs, though that was obviously a challenge due to them being a minority population, them wanting to hold on to their Chinese traditions. But if there was a bunch of men and not much women, depending on the time, so like the 19th century, they would most likely procreate with someone who was not of their same race. And that causes for a whole different layer of issues when it comes to the mixed race population of Chinese descent. But that might be another video for another day. So, anyways, they have played a crucial role in the island's economic development, particularly in Kingston Free Zone, where many work in the garment industry. And it's interesting because if you look at a lot of the Jamaican hair stores or the black hair stores, whether it's in Jamaica or in the United States or Canada or even the United Kingdom, a lot of them are owned by Chinese people. And I always found that to be very weird. But looking at the history of Jamaica and the businesses that the Chinese Jamaicans um, did, it kind of makes sense. And I guess this somewhat ties into what's happening now with a lot of Caribbean places where a lot of the businesses are owned specifically by the Chinese diasporics. When it comes to the historical challenges, despite their contributions, Chinese Jamaicans face discrimination and harsh working conditions, leading to a significant number of them eventually leaving Jamaica. And they face this discrimination not just by white Jamaicans, but by black Jamaicans as well. But despite that, they have since become integral to Jamaican society, contributing to the island's cultural fabric. So apparently, from 1910 onwards, Chinese immigrants were required to pay a $30 deposit and to pass, or they had to take a written test that they had to pass to demonstrate that they could write at least 50 words in three different languages. I wonder why three and not two, though English is the main language in Jamaica, and the second language would obviously be Chinese since they're coming from China. As the population increased as the mid 20th century took place, there were a lot more restrictions that were being placed on the Chinese migrants, though they're starting to somewhat relax by 1947 due to lobbying by the Chinese consulate. So, when it comes to the census, in the 1943 census, it was broken down in three groupings. One was China born, the second was local born, so you're born in Jamaica. And the third is Chinese colored, so that's the latter, referring to the multiracial people of mixed African and Chinese descent. Okay, so I made a video on the Dougla population in Jamaica, and I didn't know what they called the Blasian population in Jamaica, but this term uses Chinese colored, so that might be the title that I use, and I might make a video specifically on the Chinese colored. And of course, they have their own identities and struggles separate from Chinese Jamaicans. So pretty much all of this had Chinese Jamaicans being the second largest Chinese population in the Caribbean behind Chinese Cubans. That's interesting, and that's not something that I was really expecting. So by 1963, the Chinese had a virtual monopoly on the retail trade in Jamaica, controlling 90% of the dry goods stores and 95% of the supermarkets, along with extensive holdings in other sectors such as laundries and bedding parlors. In the 1970s, thousands of Chinese Jamaicans fled a wave of inter-ethnic violence against them. That's something that I definitely want to look into more. At first, they mainly went to Canada, which is much more open to immigration than the United States, with the US becoming a major immigration destination later on as the US loosened their immigration rules. And I'm wondering that's still due to the Anti Chinese Act, though I don't know if that was a thing in the 1970s. So, as a result of this, there are enclaves of Chinese Jamaicans that's found in places like Toronto, New York City, and South Florida. Now, interestingly enough, there was a new wave of Chinese migration to Jamaica that started in the 1980s and 1990s, consisting of Hong Kong and Taiwanese entrepreneurs who set up textile factories on the island, targeting the US market and often bringing in migrant workers from China to staff their ventures. And that could be an entire series of videos on its own that I may or may not get around to. Okay, so that concludes this video. It's definitely interesting looking at the journey of Chinese Jamaicans in Jamaica and the further diaspora. I've had my own experiences with Chinese Jamaicans, and it's interesting comparing them to Indo Jamaicans since they came to Jamaica with the same process of indentured servitude, though they obviously created their own communities, and they're of a similar enough size when it comes to their demographics. I don't think I'm going to be making any more racial or ethnic categories of Jamaica for now, since I feel like all the ones that I covered are the main ones. I might do the Chinese coloreds one, but outside of that, I'm definitely going to be looking into other countries in the Caribbean to cover regarding their demographics and their journeys within those specific countries. I'm going to continue doing the five countries most similar to this Caribbean island, though that will definitely be more sporadically, and some other, maybe more generic or general topics or whatever comes to my mind. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back with more content soon. Bye.